Today's Board of Governors meeting was an important meeting, and we had three very critical topics on the agenda today. The first was an update from the U.S.-Japan economic pillar, specifically focusing on what role we're going to play in supporting the upcoming U.S.-Japan bilateral trade agreement discussion. The second was equally an important update around the 2019 budget for the Chamber in the context of all of the good work we're doing around investing in our membership value proposition project, as well as how we're forecasting our revenues to increase over the next few years. And finally, we had an important update from our SME CEO Council led by Harry Hill. So our discussion centered around what we can do to be much more actively involved in representing the interests of American businesses operating in Japan. And in particular, we're discussing how we can provide input to the USTR, who are currently drafting the negotiating objectives for the U.S.-Japan trade agreement. Our written comments are due November 26, and we're working very closely with the U.S.-Japan Business Council as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in order to ensure that we have aligned positions where appropriate. In addition, we're very excited to take advantage of an opportunity for us to meet with Trade Policy Staff Committee in a public hearing in Washington, D.C. on December 10th. And Chris LaFleur, our chairman, will be representing the ACCJ's interest there. In addition, Laura Younger, our executive director, will join him, and they'll take advantage of not only the public hearing with the Trade Policy Staff Committee, but an opportunity to visit the newer members of Congress that have come through from the recent elections and familiarize them with not only the U.S.-Japan relationship and the important role that Japan plays for many American businesses, but also our policy positions in the upcoming trade negotiations. The discussion then focused on next year, and in particular, as many of you are familiar, we typically do one door knock to Washington, D.C. every year in April. And we've historically been very focused on preparing for that event with long lead times. Obviously, with the trade agreement discussions to begin in January, it's unclear exactly what the timeline is and how the whole process will play out. And we want to ensure that our input remains relevant and that we are nimble and able to do what we need to do to ensure that our issues are squarely part of the trade policy agenda. As a result, we discussed possible options for doing door knocks next year. Obviously, continuing ahead with our planned door knock in April, but also considering options to do an earlier door knock in February and potentially a second door knock later in the year if it comes down to a point where we need to meet with members of Congress to help them understand what was negotiated, the importance of it, and ultimately have Congress ratify whatever trade agreements are ultimately reached over the next 12 months. Probably one of the most important topics of the three that we discussed today at the board meeting was the discussion on next year's budget. And this budget is very different from budgets in the past in that we're making a significant investment in technology and people over the next 18 months to deliver on the commitments we made around our membership value proposition. This investment is not fully offset by revenues next year, as revenues will build starting in the second half of next year going into 2020. And so this discussion was very critical for the board members to understand both the investments that we're making as well as how the revenues build and looking at a multi-year budget. And in fact, this was the first time that we looked at a 5-year projection of our budget, dove into the assumptions behind that projection, had the board challenge us around those assumptions, and then spent a fair amount of time around the next 3 years where the full benefits and investment of MVP will begin to play out. And through this discussion, which the board was very engaged on, we not only approved next year's budget and the underlying investments in both people and technology, but we got a lot more confident in the assumptions that we have in place around how the revenues of the Chamber will grow. And this is quite significant because it's the first time in a very long time in the Chamber's history that we're not only significantly increasing our investment in our ability to deliver a better value proposition and modernize the way the Chamber does business, but we're also expecting a significant increase in revenues over the next 2 to 3 years, on the order of 30 to 40% increase in revenues, following the investments we're making next year to improve our value proposition. It was a really, really lively discussion, a lot of effective challenge from the board, and ultimately through the hard work of the chamber staff and our treasurer, Nancy Nagu, we were able to reach not only confidence with the board in what we're projecting, but also their approval on next year's budget. And now we can begin the more important work of delivering on our MVP commitments. Our final agenda topic for the Board of Governors meeting this month was an update from our SME CEO Council, which is chaired by Harry Hill. And Andrew Silberman, who's a member of the council, also joined Harry today to provide the board with important perspective from members of this important constituency to the chamber. Obviously, having SMEs thriving in the chamber, getting business from the chamber, and ultimately having more SMEs in the chamber is a critical part not only of our membership value proposition, but overall a critical part of a thriving business community in Japan. Harry and Andrew provide an important perspective from their own experience here in Japan, having started several companies, both small companies as well as, in Harry's case, a relatively large company with almost $700 million in revenues. That perspective and the board dialogue was really important to create much greater awareness, sensitivity, and ultimately improvement in what the chamber can do to create a better value proposition for SMEs here with the ACCJ. There have been clear takeaways. We're working on them together with the SME CEO Council, and I expect us to continue not only the dialogue, but to continue ways to find improvements we can make as a chamber to ensure that we remain an attractive place for SMEs to do business. There's a lot going on in the chamber, and I want to thank all of you as members who every day do so much of the heavy lifting and good work that makes our brand such a great brand in Japan. I want to thank you all very much, and we're going to continue giving these updates so that you understand what we're doing as a Board of Governors to ensure that the chamber continues to be the leading chamber in Japan.